Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. I'm Richard, this is Lap of the World, and today we're going to be tackling one of the more intimidating jobs on a first generation NSX, and that is replacing the fuel pump. Now it's intimidating because to do so you have to drop the tank. We finally found something that's easier to do on a Lamborghini than a Honda, but although it is intimidating on paper, I don't think it's actually that complicated of a job, so we're going to walk you through it step by step. Let's get started. To replace the fuel pump on your first generation NSX, you'll need the following tools and supplies. Moving from left to right, an assortment of ratchet handles and extensions, a 17, 14, 12, and 10 millimeter socket, as well as a 17 and 21 millimeter box wrench, a mirror to keep track of things in tight spaces, and an array of pliers for dealing with hose clamps, as well as I would recommend a pair of slip joint pliers to help gently coax some of the hoses off of their barbs. This is of course in addition to a new pump itself. In my case, I opted to replace the entire pump assembly. You do have the option of replacing just the pump motor, but in that case you will also want to order separately a gasket and strainer. I'm also choosing to take the opportunity to preventatively replace the high pressure feed line from the fuel pump to the fuel filter. Lastly, you'll need a method of elevating the rear of your NSX at least 17 inches as measured from the jack point. Before we raise the car though, there are a few things left to do. Mainly, if the car is drivable, drive it around until the gas light comes on or the needle is pretty much below the E on the gauge. If it's not currently drivable, we'll get to draining the tank later. Starting on the left-hand side of the engine bay, the first thing we're going to do is remove the entire airbox assembly here, so the filter cover, filter, and housing. That is a fairly simple process. It's just a few screws, or if you prefer the YouTube method, and we are now on to next steps. With the airbox now out of the way, the next thing we're going to do is remove this bracket and detach this bracket, as that will give us much better access to the hoses on the end of these two pipes. This is the fuel filler neck, this is the vent pipe. We need to undo those to be able to get the tank out. Some right angle pliers helped here with the hose clamps. I then used my slip joint pliers to gently grip and twist the hoses to unstick them before pulling them off their respective pipes by hand. You'll also need to disconnect this line from the charcoal canister and unclip it from a couple of guides along the bulkhead. As we move to the other side of the car and ahead in the process a little bit, we have two more lines to undo. The first is the high pressure line that goes from the pump into the fuel filter. I've also removed my fuel pressure gauge, mainly to get it out of the way because this one was a bit stubborn. And then we also will then have, slightly inboard and underneath, we also have a return line that we'll want to disconnect over here. I also elected to just go ahead and remove the fuel pump resistor as well to avoid any bracket knuckle interfacing. A couple of notes here. If you don't have a fuel pressure gauge, you can probably get away with just disconnecting the one line here from the pump to the filter. Also, I don't have the engine bay fan installed, so I have more room to work than you might. A 21mm crow's foot might be ideal here versus needing clearance for a wrench. You then use the 21mm wrench or crowfoot to keep the filter from twisting in place while you use your 17mm socket to remove the banjo bolt. With both lines disconnected from the fuel filter, I used some rubber plugs to keep debris out of the filter while I completed the rest of the job. Moving to the interior of the car, we need to disconnect this 6-pin connector that goes to the fuel pump relay. I was able to do this without removing the center panel, but it does get a little fiddly. With the connector undone, you'll need to fish it behind a larger wire harness and then push the grommet and connector through the cover plate. I'd recommend tucking them under some of the hoses on top of the fuel tank to avoid them getting snagged while you lower the tank. Underneath the car, you'll first remove the plastic cover plate under the shift levers. With the levers exposed, use your mirror to establish which way you'll need to push or pry the clips, and then undo those. There will be two washers on top of each shift bearing, a metal one and a Teflon one. Keep track of those and remember the order in which they came off. Next, unbolt the shift cable guide block and use the slack that you gained to lift the cable ends off of their pins on each lever. Undo the four 14mm bolts holding the chassis brace in place and gently move that assembly out of the way towards the front of the car, taking care not to kink the shift cables. Now is also a good time to drain the tank if you weren't able to drive off nearly all of the gas. There's a 17mm drain plug with a 36 foot-pound torque spec that will let you empty the remaining gas into an appropriate catch pan or container. You really don't want to lower a full tank. With that sorted, using a wrench to hold the lock nuts, back the tank strap bolts off a few millimeters. Not much is needed here, so no reason to go any further. They just need to be a little bit loose to facilitate removing the tank. Finally, position your forearm, an extra jack, or a friend's face underneath one side, and undo the forward tank strap bolt. Swap sides and repeat the process. The tank may not drop immediately, but a little wiggling should do the trick. Just a note, it's not going to be super light, even empty, so lower it as gently as possible. With the tank on the ground, you can slide it straight out the side of the car if you achieve the 17-inch lift height I described at the beginning. If you couldn't get the car that high, you may be able to cheese this a bit if the tank is fully empty and you can lay it flat, but it's still over a foot thick in that direction. Now that we have the tank out of the car, allow me a brief aside to cover some key takeaways, aka mistakes that I made that can then become notes for your process. I weighed the tank once I had it out of the car. There were probably 2 gallons of gas left in it, and it weighed 55 pounds. That is an awkward 55 pounds if you haven't completely drained the tank, because any of that sloshing, as I mentioned at the beginning, it's like any gallon of gas you have left in there weighs 6 pounds, 6+ pounds. So you have a small dumbbell potentially rolling around if you get the thing tilted, which can make it super awkward if you're not using a jack to lower it straight down. So just remember that. It's not going to be the lightest thing that you're going to have dropped on your face. The other key point is to make sure that as you start to lower the tank, ideally if you're doing this not just like if you don't have help or don't have a jack that you can lower it slowly, you'll want to make sure that in advance of starting to lower it, you push all of the hoses and wires through their respective holes so they don't get snagged on anything on the way down. But with that said, we did succeed in getting the tank out of the car, so let's move on. After taking a few minutes to clean and inspect the tank, it's now time to replace the pump. Start by undoing the banjo bolt and removing the output line. Place this somewhere safe if you plan to reuse it. Remove the hose clamp and slide the return hose from its barb. Next, undo the 10mm bolts holding the pump flange to the tank and then slowly remove the pump itself, remembering that if there's gas in the tank, it's likely to bring some with it. This is a good time to inspect the inside of your tank for any significant debris or corrosion, or at least get a good look at the baffling that exists in your fuel tank. Ours looked good, but I did note some browning. However, when I swiped it with a paper towel, not much came off, so I just proceeded to install the new pump. After lowering the new pump into the tank, I tightened the flange bolts in a star pattern to the specified 4 foot-pounds, or about 6 Newton meters. I then reinstalled the return line and put its clamp back into place. As a side note, I've waited until just before installation to remove the protective caps from the banjo fittings. Now that it's time, install using new crush washers on both the top and the bottom of the banjo fitting. Tighten the banjo bolt to 20 foot-pounds as per the manual. I then reinstall the fuel tank wiring harness, which I had removed for inspection and cleaning. Again, taking care to tuck the end of the harness that needs to get routed into the cabin at the top of the tank, just sort of wedging it under some of the hosing to avoid it getting pinched during reinstallation of the tank. In most other videos, this is the point where I would do some hand waving and just say that reassembly is simply the reverse of disassembly and call it a day. However, in this case, reinstalling the gas tank is definitely a different animal. Yeah, all of the fasteners and hose connections are the same, but the process is definitely different, so we won't gloss over that today. A transmission jack would probably be the ideal tool here, but that failing, a couple of regular jacks and or some kind of stackable blocks, boxes, or lumber would allow you to somewhat walk the tank back up into position, pausing once it's about 70% of the way there to fish all of the hoses and wires through their respective openings. If the tank is completely empty and you enjoy struggle, you could probably also just shove it back up there and have a friend pull hoses and wire connectors through the various orifices while you lift. Once the tank is in position, pull the tank straps flush with the tank and install the forward mounting bolts. Then go back and snug the rear bolts back up, leaving the specified 18mm gap in the strap joint. With the straps now in place, reassembly is more legitimately just the opposite of removal, with the only reminder here that you'll want to hook the shift cables back onto their respective levers before you bolt down the chassis brace or guide block, since having the extra slack will help. With work done underneath, we move back to the top of the car to reconnect the pump outlet line to the fuel filter, again tightening to 20 foot-pounds and using a 21mm wrench or crowfoot to brace the filter as you do so. Don't forget the return line while you're down there, and then reaffix and connect the fuel pump resistor as well. Finally, reattach the 3 hoses on the opposite side and then reinstall the airbox. So with the fuel tank back in the car back on the ground, and all of our hoses and wires reconnected, it's now time to fire the car up and then take a very close look and smell around the fuel filter area and underneath the car to ensure we don't have any potentially flammable leaks. I would also keep some level of vigilance through the first couple of driving cycles just to be sure that nothing loosens up with being heat cycled. But otherwise, congratulations, you've replaced the fuel pump in your first generation NSX, and we are hopefully good to go for another 30 years before we have to do this again. For our purposes on the channel, I will also report back later on how this has impacted the hesitation that we've been chasing on the car in the past few videos. But in order to keep this a concise DIY, that is going to be a story for another day. So, with that said, thank you very much for watching. I hope you found the video helpful, if not informative. But I'm Richard, this is Lap of the World, and we'll see you guys in the next video, if not out of the track.